Hi everyone, Christina Roberts here. This week's discussion board will be addressing the Bill of Rights, and specifically I will be talking about the Second Amendment. Now there is not a lot of precedent in regards to Supreme Court rulings in this regard. However, there has been a lot of debate over the intention of the Second Amendment over the last 20 years or so in light of events in our country. Therefore, I think it's important to kind of look past a lot of the rhetoric and just examine what the intention was through the historical context. In his article, Ideological Origins of the Second Amendment, Robert Shallhope does an excellent job of highlighting the historical context behind the Second Amendment and the intention behind it. But before I highlight those arguments, I just want to recap what the Second Amendment actually states. It says, quote, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of a people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed," end quote. Now, it's the first half of this statement that strict gun control advocates point to support the claim that it applies to states only, specifically that Congress cannot prohibit the state from maintaining a militia. Thus, they reject the idea that it applies to personal rights to bear arms. However, Shallhope rejects that argument, and he maintains that while these are two distinct rights, they are related and were merged together into a single amendment. He draws upon this idea of the armed citizen being necessary to a republican government, and he ties this into Machiavellian thought, who wrote about the, quote, citizen warrior being necessary to defend a republic against corruption. And it was from this line of thought that being armed and civic rights were related. And from there, Shallhope highlights many of the subsequent Republican writers who built upon this Machiavellian idea of arms being necessary for a successful republic. For example, he highlights English libertarian writer Marchmont Needham, who declared that a republican society and government rested upon the popular possession of arms. He also highlights James Harrington, who tied in the idea of gun ownership with property ownership, thus giving us the idea that it's partly its purpose is for protection. And then he also highlights the Cato letters that tie in this idea of the unarmed citizens being at will of their governments. And speaking of unarmed people, they said, quote, "It is a war of one side, and in it there is neither peace nor truce." Shallhope also highlights the political disquisitions of James Burgh, who wrote in that, those, quote, "those who have the command of the arms in a country," says Aristotle, "are the masters of state and have it in their power to make what revolutions they please." Therefore, there's this idea that in a republican government, it's necessary for the citizens to be armed in order to prevent corruption from their government. Therefore, Shallhope asserts that the intention of the founders was that it did apply to personal ownership and personal bearing arms. Of course, there are always responsibility with individual rights, and Needham kind of touches on this when he says, quote, "Arms should not be in the hands of any, but such that have an interest in the public." Now, that was kind of defined in the 1960s with the Gun Control Act of 1968. That's purpose was to regulate interstate commerce. And it's also stated that its purpose was to provide support to federal, state, and local law enforcement officials in their fight against crime and violence. But it also stated that its purpose was not to, quote, "place any undue or unnecessary federal restrictions or burdens on law-abiding citizens," end quote. And then it goes on to define who cannot have the responsibility to own a firearm, and that would be those who had been convicted of a crime that's punishment exceeded 1 year, those that were unlawfully using drugs, those who had been determined mentally defective or been in a mental hospital. Therefore, there are protections in place. Now, how those are carried out, that can be debated later on, but the Second Amendment applies to personal rights in order to maintain the republic.